Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. No one is even surprised anymore. A gunman on the campus of a community college in Oregon shoots and kills 9 people and wounds 9 others. As President Obama said, somehow this has become routine. 85,000 Americans have been killed by guns since December 2012, when a young man went into a grammar school in Newtown, Connecticut, and killed 20 small children and 6 adults. The idea that murder on this scale could somehow become routine beggars the imagination. That we tolerate it is in itself depraved. We'll talk about this and about some practical ways to approach the problem of gun violence with my guest, Richard Aborn, a longtime gun control advocate and former homicide prosecutor who is now president of the Citizens Crime Commission here in New York. Richard, thank you for coming in.
My pleasure.
Great to have you here. So you and I don't want to let out any secrets, but we're old enough to remember 1968, which is when Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King were assassinated. And since then, 1.4 million Americans have been killed by guns. That includes suicides and accidents. How did we ever become a country in which gun violence on this scale is accepted as more or less routine?
Well, because we have so much of it, coupled with the fact that we've begun to convince ourselves that there's nothing we can do about it, and that is a fatal combination. The good news is there's a lot we can do about this, both on the political front, and yes, this is a political question, and also on the policy front. We know from a lot of state experimentation that the more vigorous the gun control laws there are, the harder it is for criminals to get guns. Those states that have the lowest amount of gun control laws, i.e. where it's the easiest to get guns, tend to have the highest rates of gun violence. And those states that have the strictest gun control laws are really quite successful at keeping criminals from getting guns in those jurisdictions. The problem is we have no national law. And unless you have a national law, gun traffickers, can move from those states with strict gun control laws to those states with very weak gun control laws, buy guns in bulk, and then transport them back to cities like New York. And that's precisely what happens. And that's where we need to put our focus, is stopping that illegal trafficking. This is not about banning guns. This is not about taking guns away from law-abiding citizens. Right. And the reason I say that is that the NRA has been really quite shrewd in telling what I believe is a lie, which is that we are out to ban all guns. And the reason they do that is they want to keep their constituency, their members, fired up. They want to tell their members that unless they oppose every single gun law that comes up, right, every single politician that supports a gun control law, they will lose their right to have a gun. You want to keep a constituency motivated? Tell them they're going to lose something. But it's not true. We don't seek to ban all guns. I've been in this business for quite a while, as you know, and we've never talked about a ban movement. There's no interest in having a ban movement. We could really take this country towards a much safer path when it comes to guns if we were just allowed to put a pretty vigorous scheme in effect, a legislative scheme in effect, that would more tightly control illegal guns but still allow law-abiding citizens to get guns. That's the challenge. The really big challenge, the president also said, we're becoming numb. And that just sent a chill through me, because if we become numb to this issue, then we're done. We cannot become numb. We have to feel a sense of urgency.
Well, I think we are becoming numb. I mean, if you do the surveys and you talk about restrictions, what people are calling reasonable restrictions on guns, if you talk about gun registration and that sort of thing, if you talk about closing the gun show loophole and that sort of thing, the public favors that, and even majorities of gun owners favor it. But there does not seem to be, in general, outrage about this gun violence. That it hasn't recently taken hold. I mean, it's almost always been there. Do you have a sense of why, even when you have slaughters at schools or at grammar schools or on college campuses, there isn't more of a sense of outrage among the public? Why the response, even though it's recognized as tragic, isn't fiercer?
I do, and I'm going to be very blunt. The vast majority of homicides that take place with guns take place between young men of color, and they take place in inner cities. It is not always a constituency that cries out for sympathy, which is terrible, and we need to change that. We are all Americans. We need to protect one another. But there is something changing, and it's becoming palpable now. It is true we've had these slaughter. Sandy Hook, Columbine, San Diego, Paducah. I mean, they start to sound like Civil War battlefields after
Right.
a while, right? But they were somewhat sporadic. They were all over the country. Now that we're having more, and now that there are more and more on college campuses, for the first time, I'm hearing this phrase. In fact, I just came from a lunch and I heard it. I'm getting frightened to send my kid to college. Think about that. This is the United States of America.
Right.
We're getting afraid to send our young men and our young women to college.
It's insanity.
It is insanity. But the more people begin to personalize this, the more people begin to understand that they may be impacted, the more the politics may begin to shift. And your other point is exactly right. Gun owners, by and large, support the individual measures that we want to take in order to stop the illegal gun trafficking and therefore the illegal gun violence. The problem is what I said before. The NRA has told them they should not support
Right.
anything. And when you live in a country, as we do, with such low voter turnout, any organized constituency that votes, and that's the key here, it's not money, it's the voting, that voter intensity. If you can get your membership to vote, as the NRA has done, then you're going to stop these laws because you're going to defeat politicians that support you.
Right.
So our challenge is to instill voter intensity once again in the vast majority of Americans that support this. Don't forget, we did win the last big fights. They were 20 years ago. But the fight over the Brady Bill, the fight over the ban on assault weapons, the fight over the ban on large magazines, everybody said we were going to lose those. We were vastly outspent by the NRA, but we won. And we won because we instilled a sense of urgency and a sense of voter intensity throughout the country. Americans cared, and Americans understood that we could do something about it. That's what we have to get back to.
So you made the point that most Americans who are killed by guns are not killed in these terrible massacres on college campuses or in public schools or that sort of thing. They're killed in other ways. Often it's people of color. Most often it's young men. But talk about sort of in general and include suicides and accidents. What are the most common ways in which people are killed by guns in this country?
So the meta picture is that there's roughly 30,000 killings. It varies from year to year, but roughly 30,000 killings. About half suicides, about half homicides, sometimes a little bit more in suicides, sometimes a little bit more in homicide. And there are some accidental shootings, but not much. So the reason guns are so prominent in suicides is because they are accessible and they're instantaneous. We see the rate of suicide amongst teenagers jump about fivefold when there's a gun kept in the home. And the reason is that teenagers are impetuous, right? They have these suicidal moments, tragic as they are. They get depressed. They go to grab the gun, they fire, it's over. If they had to go to grab pills or bleach or asphyxiation or something else, you got to put a lot of thought into that. You have to execute it, and you have a lot of time to reconsider. You can unpack that.
Right.
You can call 911. With a gun, you can't. So suicides jump when there are guns, particularly unattended guns, in the home. Those will be rifles, long guns and handguns. The gun homicide problem is a handgun phenomenon. Mostly 9mm, some 38, some 32, so modestly sized guns, not hunting weapons at all. And the traffickers bring those guns, I've prosecuted these cases, the traffickers bring those guns into places like New York, and they literally sell those guns on the street, or they sell them within their social networks. And those guns get passed around usually amongst gang members, or at least kids in these wannabe gangs that we have. And those guns will be very often used in acts of retaliation, or for, frankly, some of the most ridiculous things. I mean, you get fights over a girl. I understand that's a big deal to a high school kid.
I've covered it. Fights over sneakers.
Exactly, yeah. So that's right. But when you have a gun, the mix changes. It becomes a deadly combination. Right. You got that adolescent anger, that adolescent sense that nothing's going to happen to me, and the gun. It's a lethal combination. So we get a lot of those kinds of shootings. The accidental shootings we see are the sort of uncommon ones. Lawful gun owners don't realize the gun's loaded, it accidentally discharges, but also kids find their parents' guns.
Very young children sometimes.
Yeah, 4, 5, 6 years old.
Yeah.
And they think it's a toy. They don't understand what it is.
Right.
They point it at their sister or their cousin, and boom, and you have a horrendous event in that home.
So you're talking about this illegal gun trade, guns ending up in the hands of potential killers or kids who are going to misuse them and shouldn't have the guns in the first place. If you could just sort of, if you had the clout to just decide on the steps we would take to fight that gun trade, what would you do? What are the first things you would do?
So there's a policy side to that, and there's a political side. Let me take both, okay? Mm-hmm. So the policy side is we need to have a debate about comprehensive gun control law in this country. We need licensing of all handgun sales, limitation of one handgun a month, full registration, mandatory safety training, and when it comes into effect, smart gun technology mandated. That would be a good, comprehensive policy. We get those kinds of law in place, the gun control movement could probably go out of business. In fact, it could go out of business. Mm-hmm. That's the policy answer. That's where we need to be. The political answer is because of the intransience of Congress, we have been forced into this incremental debate where we can only talk about one measure at a time. Even when I was leading the movement, we had to talk about one measure at a time. We did Brady first, then the ban on assault weapons, then the ban on large magazines. So right now our focus is on closing what's called the gun show loophole. Right now the Brady background check, which has been wildly successful, 2.2 million people have been stopped from buying guns. That had a loophole in it, which was if you are a private owner of a gun and you want to sell to me, another private individual, there's no mandated background check. A lot of guns are leaking into the illegal market that way. And then we have these gun shows across America where people come to show guns and trade guns, and a lot of criminals are going to gun shows and getting their guns because there's no background check. That's where we need to focus our energy. We need to focus our energy on closing that loophole.
And what's the gun lobby, when they fight, for example, closing the gun show loophole, what's their rationale?
It's the first step towards a ban. Everything is the first step towards a ban. No matter what you talk about, it's the first step towards a ban.
And no one that I'm aware of is talking about a ban on guns.
There's no discussion about a ban. There is no discussion about a ban. It is, as a matter of public policy, I'm a former prosecutor, and I've been in the gun control movement for a long time. There is no need to ban guns. And even if there was, frankly, where the courts are going, it's probably unconstitutional. It's not going to happen politically, for sure. We can't even get the background check. But it's probably unconstitutional at this point, based on the recent Supreme Court cases.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that, because even a Supreme Court case could be changed. You could change the Supreme Court years down the road. You could get a different ruling. But we do have the Second Amendment. What is your reading of the Second Amendment? What does that say? Do Americans have a constitutional right to own a gun?
So, in my own opinion, I've looked at the history and the law quite a bit. I don't think there's a constitutional right for each individual to have a gun. There's certainly a constitutional right for state militias to have weapons. Don't forget, the Second Amendment doesn't say each American has the right to own a gun. It says a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So that first part of the amendment has some meaning. I mean, it wasn't just written because...
been dispensed with.
Yeah, they were trying to fill space on the document, you know. They had plenty to write. So, but the court has ruled differently, and you're right, courts will change. But right now the law is that... roughly speaking, you probably couldn't ban all guns because the court has found a right to have a gun, probably a handgun, for self-defense in the home. But the court has also expressly said that that right is subject to reasonable regulation, and has expressly said things like licensing, bans on assault weapons, etc., would be constitutionally permissible. I'm actually not worried about the Second Amendment because nothing that we are proposing is going to run afoul of the Second Amendment.
Popular view, pretty widespread, stoked by politicians, mostly on the right, is that with so much gun violence, and the gun violence is actually overstated, but in their view, with so much gun violence, you're safer if you have a gun. So we really ought to arm everyone. And it's gone to what I think of as the extreme of actually having, in some places, I guess, carry laws on college campuses and that sort of thing. It's not, though, on the surface, an insane view. If I had a gun, I could protect myself or I could protect my family. What's your response to people who feel that way?
Well, they've clearly never fought over a parking space because you would know right away you shouldn't have a gun. I think it is some of the worst advice the NRA could possibly give. The data shows you're actually more at risk by having a gun than by not having one. But I don't want to mix the message here. Again, this is not about law-abiding citizens having guns. Some people, if they go through the necessary checks, are going to make that decision. I hope they do it responsibly. I hope they keep that gun locked up at home. But this is not about them. This is about keeping illegal guns off the street. That's what this is about, not about the law-abiding citizen. But people should look at the data, because the data says your safety is not increased. And frankly, crime is so low in this country and in almost all areas of the country that you don't need a gun for self-defense. You know, police officers are trained in the use of guns all the time, and they make mistakes. We've seen them. They make mistakes. Right. They miss their target. They shoot themselves. They shoot each other. A citizen who has had a little bit of training, 3 hours of training, is not going to be prepared to respond properly every single time they perceive a threat.
Well, but what about the idea of carrying guns on college campuses, though, even, you know, in the classroom and that sort of thing? Help us think about that.
So at one of the last shootings, there were people who were armed and they were not successful in stopping the shooter. Mm-hmm. But you've got to think about what we're talking about. We're talking about arming every single teacher and every single student on campuses throughout the country. Do we really want to try and foster an open learning environment, where we know that everybody is armed with a weapon? I don't think that's exactly how you foster open learning or an open environment. It also would be succumbing to a non-existent fear in a way that would be so disproportionate to the actual problem that it would further make the country a more violent cultural country. And we need to be careful about the culture of violence that already exists in this country. Frankly, things like the death penalty, to me, are an articulation of a culture of violence. This unfettered distribution of guns, this fascination with getting assault weapons. No one's going to dispute, I think, that our media is ultra-violent. Our games are ultra-violent. Right. So we need to be thinking about these things. These violent acts don't cause people to engage in violence, but I'm pretty sure they certainly influence some people. It is no accident that these sorts of shootings occur only in the United States. They do not occur in other countries. Right. You look at the other countries that have strict gun control laws, you do not see these kinds of shootings. I do work in the United Kingdom all the time. You just don't see this. And throughout Europe, you just don't see this. And certainly we have people with mental health issues all over the world, but you don't get these mass slayings.
You mentioned the NRA and then think about the gun lobby writ large. How did it become so powerful?
Money, money, money. Money, money, money. There is so much money on the gun side. Manufacturers, members, advertising space, retailers. I mean, just thousands of entities want to sell into the gun-owning population and will support the NRA. The NRA has also made itself into the lobby for the gun manufacturing industry, essentially, maybe explicitly, but certainly implicitly saying, we're going to protect your distribution of weapons by making sure there aren't too many laws that seek to restrict that. So the money has flowed there. But your viewers should not be deluded into thinking that this is only about money. If we were somehow able to neutralize the money, that this problem would go away. This is in some ways more importantly about what I said before, voter intensity. Right. What does that mean? If you go to the poll and you pull the lever based on a single issue, that is an enormous amount of power. And if you can get an entire constituency doing that, particularly where people don't turn out to vote, but if you can get an entire constituency doing that, that is power in a democracy that is unsurpassed by anything else. And that's what the gun control side needs to do again. We need to elect some members to Congress, and we need to vote some people out.
You mentioned the gun manufacturers. We really don't hear much about them at all. Is there anything that could be done on that side of the equation? Are there rules or regulations or restrictions that need to be imposed on gun manufacturers that would be helpful?
So there are two things happening there. One, there is a series of lawsuits moving through the courts. One in particular, I think it's in Chicago, somewhere in the Midwest, which argues that a particular manufacturer and distributor sold guns into a certain market, knowing that that retail operation was selling guns that was in excess to its local population, so they had to be feeding the illegal market. And one of those guns ended up killing a cop, or at least wounding a cop, excuse me. So there are lawsuits that can be brought against the manufacturers. We can also go after retailers that knowingly sell to what are called straw purchasers, people that have no criminal background, that go into gun stores and buy guns for people that have a criminal background, i.e. they couldn't get through the Brady background check.
Right.
We can sue them as well. Are there regulations? Sure. We could require record keeping of all multiple sales from a law enforcement standpoint, and I work with law enforcement all the time. It would be very valuable to know who's buying guns in bulk, because there's a good chance they're not doing it for personal consumption. They're doing it to feed into the illegal markets. We need to know who is buying excessive amounts of ammunition, so that we understand where people supplying criminals are getting their bullets. And we need to be able to step into there.
Right.
There's that. There should be design specifications around the guns. Do you know that the gun is the only consumer product in the United States not regulated by the Consumer Product Safety Council?
I did not know that.
Do you know that? You buy a teddy bear for a kid? That's regulated.
Let
you
me
buy
guess,
a gun,
the gun lobby had something to do with that?
I always told you were a smart guy. I don't know how they got there. Do you know that the gun lobby has managed to restrict the ability of the Center for Disease Control from doing any research around the effectiveness?
I did know that, and that was going to be one of my questions.
Is that crazy?
All right,
Research.
No, talk about that specifically. The idea that you can't do research, for example, into gun safety, into specifically gun safety, is really madness.
It's
so
crazy.
what goes on there? How are they able to do that?
What goes on is, we live in the era of big data. Research is incredibly valuable in the criminal justice field because you understand behavior methodologies and how to break up those things and how to reverse those things. The NRA has understood that research would support our position. I mean, we really shouldn't mandate a safety lock on a gun. We really shouldn't do that. They've stopped that. So they have stepped in through their incredible political power and literally stopped Congress from funding any research and gotten Congress to pass laws, I guess, barring these research arms of the government from doing research into gun safety. I mean, this is craziness.
We're running out of time, but I wanted to ask you quickly about the technology that you mentioned that might be coming down the pike that would help in terms of gun safety. What's on the agenda?
So really interesting stuff. So our optical software, our ability to read digital imprints, our ability to read fingerprints is all changing very rapidly, and there is a lot of thought out there and some prototypes that you could actually build sensors into guns that would only allow the owner of the gun to fire that weapon. Mm-hmm. And that's important because so many times a gun goes from the legal market to the illegal market. If you would think about the iPhone with the thumb imprint, it's exactly that idea. Only if you put your thumb imprint on that iPhone can you open up that iPhone. We'd like to do the same with guns, and once that technology is perfected, have that mandated. That would just be a tremendous help in the illegal market. Do you know a lot of illegal guns get traded around social networks?
I do know that, right.
Yeah, that would stop immediately. If you had to imprint the gun in the retail shop, you couldn't then give it to a criminal to sell into the illegal market. And even short of that, there are now mechanical devices, not electronic, mechanical devices, almost like a combination lock, that you could build into the handle of the gun so that you would have to know the 3-digit combination in order to fire the gun. Even that would be a tremendous help. It would cut down on suicides, it would cut down on kids getting their parents' guns and shooting it, and it would cut down on the illegal markets because you'd have to pass the combination around every time you traded the gun. And at some point that would break down in the chain of distribution.
Richard Aborn, thank you so much for coming by. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
We'll be back in a moment with a final word. ESPN.com ran a terrific story recently about Peyton Manning, the Denver Broncos quarterback who was a lock for the NFL Hall of Fame. After nearly 18 years in the league, Manning is a physical mess. He needs help just to remove his cleats after a game. Like nearly all NFL players, Manning gets beaten and battered on a weekly basis in ways that human beings were not designed for. He's had 4 surgeries on his neck. He wears a brace on his left knee. None of this is odd for a football player. In fact, what we know of Manning's physical woes is not as bad as the terrible stories we've heard about the nightmarish long-term damage that can result from repeated blows to the head, season after season. Early onset dementia and death from suicide are among the most awful consequences. Football is my favorite sport, but the violence has become so extreme, so routine, that it's fair to ask if it is still possible to justify it as entertainment. Millions of parents have already decided that the sport is too dangerous for their sons to be allowed to participate. Many years ago, I stopped watching boxing because some of my very favorite boxers ended up as basket cases due to all of the punishment they had absorbed. In football, the goal is not to deliberately hurt your opponent, but often the end result is the same: physical catastrophe. Every effort humanly possible should be made to lessen the toll of football. It's still the most popular sport in America, but that won't last if it becomes widely and routinely perceived as inhumane. That's all for now. See you next time.